Tonight only on 7 News, a 6-month investigation into the Boy Scouts. For most boys, being a Boy Scout is a positive experience, but for some, the experience left them scarred for life.
In an exclusive interview, the organization that positively influenced hundreds of thousands of lives is now answering questions on how it failed to protect hundreds of boys.
For the first time, you'll see just how many scouts were sexually abused all across the nation.
Scripps national investigative correspondent Jim Osmond is on the trail of betrayal.
On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty.
It's an oath Boy Scouts know.
To God and my country, to obey the Scout law.
The Boy Scout pledge, that a Boy Scout will do his best to do his duty and to keep himself morally straight. But the iconic American organization may itself have been betraying that oath, keeping quiet about unthinkable acts against children.
He stole my boy.
Like the pedophile priest in the Catholic Church and the Penn State abuse scandal. It's institutional secrecy and a culture of concealment.
They were doing so to protect the name Boy Scouts of America.
Tonight, the Scripps National Investigative Team reveals a disturbing pattern of crimes against children that many times went unreported by the Boy Scouts, where sexual abusers were quietly kicked out, able to victimize other children.
All of this could have been prevented a long time ago.
We're on their trail, the trail of betrayal. Sir, why are you running away?
You think your kids are safe.
Veronica Aiken's son Chance joined the Boy Scouts in Amarillo, Texas, but what happened next stunned her.
We didn't know anything until actually the police came knocking on my door.
The police told her this man, Scout leader Melvin Estes, had sexually assaulted her son at scouting events along with 3 other boys in 1988. Estes was later convicted of his crimes.
It's still painful. I don't know that it ever really goes away.
Veronica Aikens is just one of thousands of voices telling painful stories about molesters in the Boy Scouts. For 6 months, this group of journalists with the Scripps National Investigative Team reviewed 30,000 court-ordered release documents spanning 2 decades, most of them dealing with molesters in the Scouts. Now tonight, we're uncovering the sheer magnitude of what's in those files. It's a story they never wanted you to hear.
They were sitting on a powder keg of information.
Between 1970 and 1991, the files contained the cases of more than 1,800 individuals that the Boy Scouts deemed ineligible to serve for a number of reasons, the majority for claims they molested children. And the files reveal allegations of at least 2,000 Boy Scouts molested by Scout leaders all across the nation. Tim Kosnoff is a Seattle attorney who represents a number of Boy Scout victims.
The Boy Scouts of America betrayed the trust that was granted to them by the American public.
I'm a 14-year-old Boy Scout. Our Scoutmaster has had to leave our troop for molesting 2 of our younger Scouts.
In 1987, 14-year-old Adam Schertzel wrote this letter to the scouting magazine Boy's Life. He's now 39.
He molested them physically and possibly us mentally.
And Adam wasn't the only Scout asking for help. In 1976, 2 St. Louis Scouts wrote to the Scout Committee chairman, complaining that they were being molested by their Scoutmaster. The chairman writes back, quote, "Can't do anything about it." In cases where Scout officials were first informed of sexual abuse, our investigation reveals the Boy Scouts failed to report it to authorities 72% of the time. In 1983, Boy Scout officials were told by parents that this man, Paul Kofoot, allegedly sexually molested their 11-year-old boy at an Evanston, Illinois camp. The Boy Scouts didn't go to authorities. The only repercussion for Kofoot was to be booted out as a Scout leader.
How could you let somebody like that go and not do something about it? I mean, you're letting a pedophile go?
A Scout official in a letter to Kofoot told him the matter would be, quote, maintained as confidential. And we uncovered 146 cases where the Boy Scouts assured Scout leaders accused of molesting boys that the matters would be kept confidential.
I mean, the Boy Scouts, wow.
Sean McPherson, who lives in Nebraska, knows exactly who Paul Kofoot is. But Sean wasn't ever a Boy Scout. Kofoot sexually molested Sean as a 13-year-old, 8 years after the Boy Scouts failed to report Kofoot to police. Sean never knew about the Boy Scouts' allegations against Kofoot until we showed him.
All of this with me and with these other kids could have been prevented a long time ago.
Sean's parents reported this case to police. He was convicted and is now a registered sex offender in Nebraska. And all of these men were reported to the Boy Scouts for allegedly molesting Scouts. but the Scouts didn't call authorities. Each man later caught and convicted for other sex offenses, mainly with children. Like former Virginia Scout leader Michael Eck, in 1991 he admitted to inappropriate sexual behavior with Scouts. Again, Scout officials didn't call police. They simply barred him from scouting. 3 years later, he was convicted of sexual battery in a different case. You're Michael Eck, right? The Boy Scouts never held you accountable, did they, sir? His case and the others raise serious questions for the Boy Scouts of America. There wasn't a culture of secrecy in those files?
You mean a culture of secrecy in protecting bad people? No.
Boy Scouts of America President Wayne Perry believes overall the confidential file system has worked.
It protected a lot of kids.
A lot of kids?
Absolutely.
But he also says it didn't protect all kids, and for the first time concedes.
It is a terrible failure. It's a moral failure.
The Boy Scouts released a report last month from a paid contractor that looked into those confidential files. The report concludes the Boy Scouts prevented at least 175 suspected abusers from becoming Boy Scout leaders. Now, tomorrow night, we're looking into systematic failures that allowed some offenders to move from troop to troop. I'm Scripps National Investigative Correspondent Jim Osman in Washington.
And the Trail of Betrayal is a Scripps national investigation on air, online, and in print. We continue our coverage on 10news.com. You will find in-depth coverage that includes the breakdown of reported Scout abuse by state.
All new tonight on ABC 15, an in-depth look at systematic failures in the Boy Scouts that allowed known child molesters to remain as Scout leaders.
Our Scripps National Investigative Team is breaking news tonight with new action from the Boy Scouts in response to our investigation.
Investigative correspondent Jim Osman is following the trail of betrayal.
They are known molesters who kept moving from troop to troop.
Somebody knew that. He had a file.
Scout leaders allowed to commit unthinkable acts against children.
They put Scouts at risk of harm.
You'll hear one of the victims speak out for the first time.
You've never been interviewed before.
All new tonight, the Scripps National Investigative Team will reveal systematic failures in the Boy Scouts to protect children. We reviewed 30,000 once confidential Boy Scout documents and found a revolving door of suspected pedophiles, a breakdown in background checks, and repeat offenders who kept right on being Boy Scout leaders.
When you get a repeat case, it's just very hard to understand. Yeah, they failed people.
We're back on the trail of betrayal. In Colorado, Floyd David Slusher took advantage of failures in the Boy Scout system that created a virtual revolving door for child molesters.
It brings up some anger. It brings up frustration. That whole sense of, literally my heart will begin to race.
Clay Evans is a 50-year-old man who can't bear to look at this convicted pedophile's picture because of what this man did to him and other Boy Scouts 35 years ago. Evans says Scout leaders didn't believe him when he told about the abuse.
I was shocked. I thought it was just me they were ignoring, and it wasn't.
The confidential files reveal Scout officials had reports that Slusher was a repeat sexual molester.
How does he wind up as a Scoutmaster?
The Boy Scouts created a file for Slusher in 1972 after he was caught molesting a scout at a Boy Scout of America camp in Germany and was thrown out of scouting. By the next year, he was back in charge of Scouts again, this time in Boulder, Colorado. And by 1976, he was running 2 different troops. A known abuser once caught in the act, going through a virtual revolving door, continuing to prey on children. Finally nabbed in 1977, police at the time said there were too many victims to interview.
It messed with everybody's head. It was hard to be at that age and to have that kind of invasion.
46. That's how many men we found in the confidential files like Slusher who went through those revolving doors, caught, removed, and allowed back in again.
I have nothing to hide.
Paul Ernst was the head of Boy Scout registration and kept the confidential files from 1971 until 1994. His name appears in the Boy Scout confidential files hundreds of times. Why wasn't more done?
I don't know. I can't look behind me. I don't know what happened. We made decisions then, and they've, as I say, times have changed.
He said the confidential files were designed to keep out molesters.
I wasn't the policymaker of the Boy Scouts of America. I was just the person handling them.
The Boy Scouts had plenty of problems in screening Boy Scout leaders. The Scripps National Investigative Team uncovered 88 cases where Scout officials failed to conduct adequate background checks, allowing men with prior criminal convictions into the Scout ranks. We also found cases of more than 100 repeat offenders, Scout leaders who were reported to the Boy Scouts for molesting, simply allowed to remain in their volunteer positions. Like Art Humphreys in Virginia, in 1978 he was accused of molesting a Scout. A Scout executive documented the alleged abuse but didn't go to police. Humphreys remained in his position. When police themselves finally caught up with him 6 years later, records show Humphreys had sexually molested at least 20 boys, many who were part of a Scout troop for the disabled.
They knew that this perpetrator had had issues. There had been reports that there was a problem.
Melvin Estes was a repeat offender, the Scoutmaster who molested Veronica Aiken's son, Chance. Aiken says Scout leaders chose not to believe the reports and put Estes in charge of her son's troop. It was a decision that devastated her family.
He robbed my son of his dignity, his pride, his childhood. He damaged my child. And how can anyone ever fix that?
And as a mother, that's painful.
Very painful. Because I can't fix it.
Recently, the Boy Scouts of America promised to turn over to police names in the confidential files of suspected pedophiles. But in an exclusive interview with the Scripps National Investigative Team, Boy Scouts of America President Wayne Perry went one step further.
Are we going to protect people who made mistakes, willingly made mistakes? And the answer is no.
In addition, Perry revealed for the first time they'll also turn over names from the files of Boy Scout officials who failed to contact authorities.
I will talk to our youth protection director, who's a retired policeman, and ask him. I'll say, how do we go about doing this? We'll be happy to do that.
Now, the obligation to report sexual abuse is dictated by state law. We found at least 28 states where the statute of limitations is still open for incidents dating back to 1971. Tomorrow, a call for action.
It's time for Congress to investigate.
I'm Scripps National Investigative Correspondent Jim Osman in Washington.
Only on 7 tonight, the Scripps National Investigative Team looks at how the Boy Scouts are protecting children today.
So over the last 2 days, we've revealed systematic failures within the Boy Scouts that led to sexual abuse over 2 decades.
Well, tonight we uncover challenges the Boy Scouts still face in keeping Scouts safe.
The Scripps National Investigative Correspondent Jim Osmond following the trail of betrayal.
The Boy Scouts of America say times have changed.
We have a very good system of protecting kids.
And just like the Catholic Church and the Penn State abuse scandals, the Scripps National Investigative Team has shown how the Boy Scouts of America operated under institutional secrecy, creating a culture of concealment that put thousands of Scouts at risk between 1970 and 1991. So what about today? This former Scout leader says there are still problems.
It is a great program, except that protecting the boys, they don't do.
I believe when my grandson joined Scouting, he's safer than any other place he could be.
And now, after all that we've uncovered, there are calls for lawmakers to intervene.
It's time for Congress to investigate.
Obviously, a pretty old camp.
Tom Stewart was once a Boy Scout leader and led young men, including his sons, on camping trips here.
I became increasingly more aware that, the Boy Scouts still were not protecting boys the way they should.
But Tom Stewart still expected stringent screening when he joined as a Scout leader in 2001.
They didn't do a background check on me.
In fact, BSA didn't require mandatory background checks until 2008. But listen to Bob Mazuka in this statement from 2010, Boy Scouts of America CEO, who retired in August.
We do a criminal background check on every applicant to be an adult leader.
But there are still questions about the quality of the Boy Scouts background checks. Brian Liska was convicted for having sex with a 14-year-old girl. But in 2011, he was a Boy Scout leader and was arrested at a Scout meeting at a school because it violated the conditions of being a registered sex offender in Illinois. The issue of youth protection is vitally important to fathers like Tom.
Sadly, I was abused here.
Because the Seattle area camp where he once led the Boy Scouts is the same camp where a Boy Scout leader molested him when he was a boy, molesting him and his brother.
We were, abused hundreds of times. We were raped and sodomized.
After all he went through as a kid, he still believed in scouting. But when Tom saw gaps in youth protection as a scout leader, he quit in 2003. Current Boy Scouts of America President Wayne Perry says the Scouts have other guidelines to keep boys safe.
We emphasize too deep. I see it all the time. I see the commitment people have.
Too deep means 2 adults at all times supervising Scouts, a policy since 1987. But in 13 recent criminal court cases, the Scripps National Investigative Team found incidents where Scout leaders molested children at scouting events while they were alone. Like William Huffling, a former suburban Detroit Scout leader who in 2009 gave a Boy Scout liquor and molested him in a tent. The two were alone. Or take Scott Allen Herrick, who in 2010 provided alcohol to Boy Scouts, showed them pornographic videos, and hosted them for overnights alone. Before authorities caught him with 100,000 images of child porn at a Twin Lake, Michigan Boy Scout camp. He's now in prison.
We have trained millions of people in what is youth protection.
The Boy Scouts of America President Wayne Perry says they do put boys first.
Today, I think we do a very good job. Around the world, people asked us to use our youth protection system.
In an exclusive interview with the Scripps National Investigative Team, the president of the Boy Scouts now says he will turn over to police the names of scouting officials who may not have done the right thing when it comes to reporting. But who will hold the Boy Scouts of America organization accountable? Just recently, victim advocates called for a congressional audit. That's what leads us to Washington. Congress has the power to investigate the Boy Scouts, according to author Patrick Boyle, who wrote the book Scouts Honor about molesters in the Boy Scouts.
Congress certainly has it within its authority to call them forward and actually get some answers that probably we're not getting.
After all, Congress approved the federal charter that created the Boy Scouts in 1916. And Congress gives the Boy Scouts perks to help run the organization. That was pointed out in a lawsuit filed against the Scouts by Seattle attorney Tim Kosnoff.
There's probably 25 different code sections where some member of Congress inserted some sort of giveaway.
Congress requires the Agriculture Secretary to give grants to the Boy Scouts and the Defense Secretary to loan property for the Boy Scouts Jamboree.
This does come at the expense of the American taxpayer.
The Boy Scouts of America have been sued more than 100 times since the 1980s regarding sexual abuse cases. At least that many are still pending. The Scripps National Investigative Team will continue on television, in print, and online to follow the trail of betrayal. I'm Scripps National Investigative Correspondent Jim Osman in Washington.